Sweden, France, Germany. These three European countries have fought wars against Russia over the past 3 centuries. Sweden invaded Russia during the 21-year-long Great Northern War in the 18th century. France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, invaded on the 24th of June, 1812. And Germany invaded almost exactly on the same day in 1941. All 3 wars ended with Russia's absolute victory, and the 3 invading countries saw a reduction in their territorial size, population, and influence. Why did the 3 aforementioned countries fail in their campaigns against Russia? Historians usually attribute their defeat to Russia's fierce winters, scorched earth tactics, and strategic depth, making it possible for Russians to withdraw deep inland until the invaders could no longer maintain effective supply networks for their armies. Another important factor was Russia's comparatively large population and ability to conscript a sufficient number of soldiers to wear down and repel the invading forces. The first advantage to be mentioned in most cases is fiercely cold winter weather, which the Russians are accustomed to, but which their enemies have underestimated. But Sweden is also a northern European country with cold winters. The Finns, for their part, successfully used the winter as a defensive element when Russia invaded their country in 1939. This suggests that cold weather, which affects both the attackers and the defenders in a war, might not be the main reason for the defeat of Russia's past enemies. So what are the 3 common mistakes that Sweden, France, and Germany made in their military campaigns? First of all, none of the 3 invading countries had any significant allies. During the Great Northern War, King Charles XII fought nearly alone against a coalition of enemies, including the Danish, Norwegian, Saxon, Prussian, and Polish-Lithuanian kingdoms. Although Sweden did form alliances, it was difficult to maintain them throughout a war that eventually lasted 21 years. King Charles won brilliant victories at first, but a crushing defeat at Poltava in 1709 turned the tide of the Great Northern War against Sweden. In the end, Sweden lost significant territories, and Russia emerged as a major power in the Baltic region. Napoleon Bonaparte assembled an army of over 600,000 men. About half of its ranks were filled by non-French conscripts from all over Europe. Apart from the French and Poles, however, few of Napoleon's troops felt any affection for their emperor, nor enthusiasm for his cause, and were serving out of duress. Napoleon initially won outstanding victories and even captured Moscow, where he expected to find a delegation of Russian officials ready to negotiate a peace treaty. When he realized that no peace was forthcoming, he made the fateful decision to retreat from Moscow. Germany was the enemy of nearly all the rest of the world. Germany's only significant allies were Italy and Japan, both of which provided negligible support. Since the collapse of the Roman Empire, Italy has made great contributions in the fields of Christianity, science, painting, music, and architecture, but ceased being a significant military power. Moreover, Italy's misadventures in Africa and Greece forced Germany to intervene and stabilize these 2 fronts. Japan, on the other hand, made the enormous mistake of attacking the United States instead of Russia. The General Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army developed a plan for an invasion of the Russian Far East, but the plan was eventually abandoned after increasing economic sanctions by the United States and the dimming prospects for a swift German victory in Europe. Russia's situation would have been far more difficult if the Red Army had been forced to fight on 2 fronts. Germany's lightning war tactics were effectively demonstrated in Poland and France, but failed to achieve a decisive victory in Russia. Another important mistake in all 3 wars was to place almost exclusive emphasis on the military aspect of the invasions, without taking advantage of Russia's internal weaknesses. Russia's colonialist nature, vast territories, social inequality, and diverse population make the country prone to internal conflicts and power struggles. None of Russia's invaders tried to seriously capitalize on the country's opposition and secessionist forces. Numerous minorities continue to feel a deep-seated resentment against the government and its Russification policies. For centuries, political opposition in Russia has been largely hidden and muted due to well-founded fears of persecution, but it does exist nonetheless. Karl von Clausewitz correctly recognized that Russia cannot be conquered through traditional military means, but rather must be weakened by its own internal divisions, which in turn would make the country vulnerable to an external threat. It's worth noting that his views on Russia were shaped by his own experiences in the Russian army during the French invasion of 1812. Hundreds of thousands of Russian and other Soviet citizens served in the German armed forces, and in 1944 they officially formed the Russian Liberation Army. But that was too little and too late to prevent Germany's defeat in Russia. Millions of Russians had lost their loved ones during the Stalinist purges, and many were prepared to fight against the communists, even if that entailed being under nominal German command. The Germans, however, were consumed by their ideology and treated the Russian population badly in the territories that they occupied. Russian prisoners of war were poorly fed and used as forced labor. Many of the recruits in the auxiliary forces volunteered just to get out of prisoner of war camps, which were notorious for starving Soviet prisoners to death. It didn't take long for the Russians to loathe the Germans and to see the local communists as a lesser evil than the foreign invaders. This cruelty helped Stalin to fire up a sense of patriotism and to rally the Russian people behind him. The third mistake is that none of the aforementioned countries offered any concessions to either their enemies or potential allies. Descriptions about Sweden's campaigns in the Great Northern War provide no indication that King Charles promised anything to his enemies or potential allies. King Charles was known for his unwavering commitment to his goals and his reluctance to make concessions. Napoleon termed his invasion the Second Polish War in an attempt to gain increased support from Polish patriots who wanted the Russian part of Poland to be joined with the Duchy of Warsaw and then reestablish an independent Polish state. However, as time went on, the Polish people began to feel that Napoleon was not committed to restoring Polish sovereignty and was instead using the Duchy of Warsaw as a means to expand his own power and influence. In his book, The Campaign of 1812 in Russia, Clausewitz mentions that Napoleon tried to sow division in Russia between the government and the nobility, who had a strained relationship and often clashed over issues such as taxation, land ownership, and representation. Napoleon ultimately failed to achieve this goal, as most Russian nobles viewed the French invasion as a threat to their power, privilege, and way of life. During World War II, the people in the Baltic states and Ukraine viewed the arrival of the Germans as a potential means to achieve independence, and many of them joined auxiliary units of the German army. The situation varied across different regions, but generally the Germans imposed their own occupation in those countries and exploited their resources to fuel the war effort. While it is true that the winners of many wars have not offered anything to their enemies, military victories and alliances can be easier to achieve if one does so. Legend has it that Alexander the Great's army increased after each battle because he managed to turn many of his prisoners of war into allies. The Greek army consisted of approximately 40,000 men at the beginning of Alexander's campaign. It's estimated that by the time he conquered the Persian Empire, his army had expanded to over 100,000 men. Moreover, Alexander the Great was known for his tolerance and respect for other cultures, despite his desire for conquest. After World War II, the Americans helped war-torn Germany with the Marshall Plan, while William Edwards Deming implemented a quality control system for the Japanese industry, thus turning Germany and Japan from enemies into trusted friends and allies in a very short time. East Germany, for its part, readily gave up its statehood in 1990 to rid itself of Russian dominance and reunite with West Germany.